Hello, my name is Chris Bergin. I'm the president and publisher of Tax Analysts. Tax Analysts is a not-for-profit organization. Our main mission is to facilitate an informed debate on tax policy and tax administration. This is the first in a series of videos that we're going to be doing to help educate the public and the media in what's going on in the tax world, which is actually very interesting and relevant to all of us. Our first series is going to be on tax reform, which has been very much in the news lately. We will look into the various aspects of tax reform and try to predict what's going to happen.
So, Chris, we hear a lot of talk about tax reform. What do you think it is they're talking about?
Well, I think right now it's whatever they think it's what they're talking about. Tax reform can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Is it changing the individual side? Is it changing the corporate side, as the president's proposed? Is it strictly just the income tax? Or are we going to talk about things like a value-added tax or a carbon tax, which you're an expert on? Right now, I think they're trying to figure all that out. They call it in the Senate the blank slate. I think that pretty much says what tax reform is right now. It's a blank slate.
I think that's right, but I also hear a lot of conversation about tax reform being broadening the base, finding more things to tax, whether it's fewer deductions or more kinds of income, and lowering the rate. The thing that's interesting to me about that is, if you look back historically, tax reform has been closing loopholes, taking away special incentives. Reducing the rate's been tax cuts, and we've mixed those two things up, and I think a lot of the people who are talking about tax reform are really hoping what they're going to get is a tax cut. And in an era of budget deficits the size we have, that doesn't seem like a likely outcome.
No, it doesn't to me either. And as you know, whatever they do, they're going to pick winners and losers. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. And I think that's the sort of paper chase for the press here, is watching the winners and losers. If I was talking to a young journalist who wanted to cover tax reform, I'd say, follow the winners and losers. That's the first thing I would do. I don't know how you cut taxes in this kind of an environment, how you lower revenue. And I think that's the ultimate problem in Congress is the Republicans believe in this principle called revenue neutrality, which for me showed up in the '86 reform. And that means theoretically we're not going to increase taxes. And the Democrats are looking at tax reform to increase revenue to deal with the deficit. They're going to have to figure out how to reconcile that before we get to whatever tax reform is going to mean.
Well, that really brings us to the question, what are the chances that we're going to have a real tax reform in the next couple of years?
I think none. But with the caution that I'm sort of a child of the '86 Tax Reform Act. That's really where I come into the policy world. And in the '86, as you know, because I believe you were on the Hill during that, the influence of the Treasury Department and the White House was incredible. And that's where the leadership came. Now, some people will argue that tax reform can originate with congressional leadership. I'm not so sure. But right now, this president is not engaged in tax reform, whatever it means.
Well, that's right. I mean, one of the problems in having tax reform originate in the Congress is you might not have 535 people leading it, but you've probably got, between the two tax writing committees, 50 people trying to lead tax reform. And what my mom used to say is probably true, that a camel is a horse put together by a committee. So you have to wonder how you get tax reform that looks sensible if you have 50 different people leading.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I guess sooner or later you're going to get to the committee building the camel. But if we go back to the '86 model where it came out of Treasury, there was one idea, Treasury won, and then we brought it to the committee, and then we got the camel that was the '86 Tax Act, which obviously far from perfect, but it started out pretty well. If we're going to start with the committee to build the camel, it's going to be some awkward-looking camel when they're done with it. I mean, so I just don't know how you get any traction now the next couple of years.
I think that's right, and it really goes back to the deeper question you talked about earlier, which is we don't have a fundamental agreement on the size of government. Two political parties are 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP apart in how big they think government ought to be. Well, you translate that back into revenue per year, that's a $300 billion, $400 billion disagreement over how much tax we should take in. So you don't have a basic beginning point. '86, we were agreed on how much tax we would take in. Actually, we were pretty tolerant of deficits in '86. We're not there now. And so the question is, how do you find an agreement when you don't know what the foundational starting point is?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, the one thing I have to remind myself when I talk about this is it's not 1986, it's 2013. There's a huge difference. But the question is, I wonder what you think, have we started? I mean, if we get nothing for 2 years or 3 years, which I don't think we're going to get anything with this White House, but have we started? Are we sort of back to 82 or 84? Has the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, in its own little way, sort of started the movement that will eventually end up with whatever we decide tax reform looks like?
That's a fascinating question. I think maybe my view would be is we have started to start. We don't have anything that is comparable to the big vision bills that we had in 82 and 84, Bradley, Gephardt, Kemp, Kasten. Ron Wyden has a comprehensive bill out there. We have some partial drafts from Chairman Camp. We have nothing really concrete from the Finance Committee to look at. So we're just beginning to see the assemblage of some building blocks. But a start to me would be somebody putting out a bill that showed you soup to nuts. What are we going to do here? And then people can look at it and say, oh, no, I don't want to do that. Or, yeah, that would be a good idea. But I don't think we're there. Maybe we'll get there this fall if the Ways and Means Committee actually marks up a bill and puts it out there for people to see. Of course, the political risk for them is pretty high.
Yeah, it's very high. I really like the way you put it. We're starting to start. And I think that's right. But in order to get from starting to start, we need some leadership. And you've got a Ways and Means Committee chairman who, at least for now, it looks like will be no longer the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee because he has a term limit. And you've got a chairman of the Finance Committee who says he's not going to run for the Senate again. So I'm not so sure where that leadership is. And I don't think the White House has got leaders. I keep looking around for Bill Bradley. In 86, again, I'm a child of the 86 Act, but in 86 you had the zealot, you had the priest, Bill Bradley, who was leading the charge, and then you had Gephardt and Rostenkowski, and a lot of leaders came up, including Reagan, and they got it done, and almost didn't get it done several times, as you know better than I do. I don't see the leadership yet. So that's why I like starting to start.
I think that's right. And, you know, you also had strong Republican leadership in 86. You had Kemp and Kasten also in there putting out comprehensive bills. So it was a bipartisan effort that really reflects the other thing that I think is so different today. When we started the 86 Act, the Congress had already done the 82 Deficit Reduction Act, the 83 Social Security Reform, and the 84 Deficit Reduction Act. Those were tough things to do, and they had learned to do them across the aisle in a bipartisan way. So there was some comedy. They didn't like each other necessarily. They certainly had their partisan views, but they had figured out how to set aside some of that partisanship to get hard things done. We don't see any evidence right now that this Congress and this set of political players know how to set aside partisanship and get things done.
I think that's an excellent point. It's almost what you see now. Back in the 80s, they at least tried to work together. What I would describe the political atmosphere today is just nasty. I mean, they're nasty to each other. And they don't want to listen to each other at all. They don't want to compromise. In certain areas of the Republican Party, compromise is a bad word. I don't know how you are a politician and compromise is a bad word. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't see any of that here. So the ultimate question comes is I think we'd agree our tax system is broken. It's pretty badly broken. Are we going to move to fix it on our own, or are we going to wait for the inevitable catastrophe to force us to fix it? And without the leadership, I'm sort of starting to lean towards the catastrophe solution.